Okay, so for the final video for Chapter 2, getting through everything for Java fundamentals, or at least the very start of it all, we're going to take a look at dialog boxes. So with dialog boxes, these are going to be small graphical windows that display either a message or maybe a request for some input. In order to use dialog boxes in Java, we're going to need the JOptionPane class. So that's going to provide us with two types of dialog boxes. We're going to have message dialogs used to display a message to the user, and then input dialogs that are used to request some input from the user. So to use the JOptionPane class, we're going to be importing it from the following package. So this one's going to be an import with JavaX, or just JavaX .swing.JOptionPane. And then once we've imported it, we can start using certain methods to create these message or input dialogs. So the showMessage dialog method is going to be used to display a message dialog. So the typical format for this method is going to look like the following. So we're going to use our JOptionPane class. So we'll say JOptionPane.showMessageDialog. This formatting right here is very similar to when we used methods with the math class, like math.pow or math.sqrt. So in this case, we're doing JOptionPane.showMessageDialog. And then in the parentheses for this, we have two things that we need to provide. So the first one is going to be this null value that we give it. So remember that we talked a little bit about null when we were discussing references to strings. So this null basically just means kind of like an empty or non-existent object. What this is referring to is dealing with what are known as components, but we're not going to worry too much about precisely what components are. So for that first thing that you put into those parentheses, you just always set that as null, and other than that, we'll just kind of ignore that. So the second value, this is the one that we're going to be the most interested in. This is where we're going to provide a string that shows the message that will actually be displayed in that message dialog. So you can kind of think of it like whenever you're specifying a string in a print statement that you want to print to the console. So let's go ahead and start setting up a program to demonstrate this. So I'm going to initially be using this to demonstrate our message and input dialogs, but as we go through this, I'll slowly refine it and turn it into kind of like an actual application. So we're going to create a new project, be a new Java application. So I'm going to go ahead and name this based on what it will ultimately be by the end of this. So we're going to go ahead and call this sales tax. And so we'll go ahead and clean up the extra comments that we don't need. For this particular one, since I am going to treat this kind of like an actual application, a very simple one, but like an actual application that you could go out and use, I'll go ahead and add a couple of comments for it, just to add a more professional look to it. So for this one, we're going to say use to calculate the sales tax for purchases. And since this is going to be based on where I live, or where the university for all these videos is going to be located, that's going to be in Texas. So I'm going to be using the Texas sales tax. So we'll say for purchases in the state of Texas. So using a sales tax of 6.25%. Okay. We'll then go ahead and remove some of these extra comments right here. I'm not going to use that one. And then right here in the main method. So for right now, we'll just go ahead and use this to test out a couple of different things to slowly get accustomed to our message and input dialogs. But again, as I mentioned, before we can actually start using any of these methods, we want to make sure that we actually import it. So we'll go ahead and add an import statement here between our package statement at the very top and the class header. So we'll say import. It's going to be javax.swing.JOptionPane. Let that autocomplete. And once we've imported this, we can go ahead and use it for a message dialog. So let's go ahead and say JOptionPane.showMessageDialog. So it starts off by giving us these two values. So it's expecting a component here, but instead of doing that, we're just going to do null. So we're just kind of disregard that part. And then this args right here. So it's kind of like the args that we used in our main method. But for this one, what I'm going to do is just a single string with the message that we want to display. So go ahead and save that. And then when I run this, it's going to display a message dialog that's going to be on top of the interface window for NetBeans itself. So this is a totally separate window from NetBeans. So we can go ahead and either push OK or push the X. Go ahead and just push OK to terminate that. So coming back over here. So in addition to our message dialogs, we also have input dialogs. So for these, we're going to be using the showInputDialog method to display our input dialogs. The typical format for this method is going to look like the following. So in addition to providing that method so we can go ahead and display our input dialog, we also need to make sure that we include a string that can go ahead and capture whatever input that the user provides. So we need somewhere to store that user input. So in this case, we see that we've got a string that we called name. We initialized it with just an empty string, so kind of just starting off with some dummy value. We then created our input dialog. The string that we put into the input dialog, that enter your name, that's going to be the request. So essentially, it's going to be like what's displayed in the input dialog's window. So similar to what we did for a message dialog. And then underneath that, you're going to see this text field where we can type in some input. And once we push enter, so we want to go ahead and move from that input dialog to whatever comes next in the program, it's going to take whatever was typed into that input dialog, or that text field, that input, and put that into this name variable. So the only value that we passed in was our string with the message to display. That message is meant to explain the purpose of the input dialog. And it's going to be similar to math.pow and math.square root, in that some value is going to be given back as a result of calling the method. And so to more accurately describe this process of getting something from our methods, we would say that the showInput dialog is going to return a string that holds the user's input. And of course, if we're using this in comparison to math.pow and math.sqrt, those two methods return a double with whatever the result is of their operations. So that general word that you're looking for is returns. That tells you that you're getting something out of a method. So we'll go ahead and add this one in as well. So coming over here, we'll go ahead and add on to this just a little bit more. So we know that we want to make a string with that's going to hold the name that we provide. We'll initially set this to an empty string. We'll then go ahead and do our call to show input dialog, and we want to assign whatever we get from it, so the user input, to name. So we're going to say name equals, and then we're going to do JOptionPane dot show message dialog, or show input dialog. And right here we'll say enter your name. And then since we still have this message dialog right here, what I'll go ahead and do is actually use this to display whatever that input was. So instead of saying hello world, let's go ahead and change this to be more like a greeting to the user. So we're going to say hello, and then comma space, and then we'll go ahead and close off our first string literal. We'll use string concatenation, so we'll have a plus sign here. We'll then put in our variable, so we'll put name right here. We'll do another plus sign, and then we'll concatenate onto that exclamation point at the end. So we'll go ahead and save this. And so now if we run this, what it's going to do is it's going to set up our name, so the string right here, initialized to just an empty string. It'll then display that input dialog, asking us to enter our name. And then once we do that and we push enter, it'll move to the next line, the show message dialog, and that's going to display this message dialog with hello and then the name that we typed in. So we'll run this. So we get that first input dialog, enter your name. So I'll just go ahead and put in my first name for this. And then when we push this OK button here, it's going to move to our message dialog, and then we'll see the phrase "Hello, Brandon" in this this dialog box. Push OK on that. So coming over here. So whenever we enter a value for input dialogs, they are always going to be treated as a string. So whenever we get something out of show input dialog, that thing that we're getting out of it is always treated as a string. So if we want to store the user's input in a variable of some type other than string, we need to go ahead and convert that value. So for example, let's say you want to store the user's input as an int. So we want to use the int data type. So we start off with two variables declared. One is going to be for the input that we get from the user from our show input dialog. The other is going to be the int. In this case, we're doing age. So we're going to say here, temporarily store the user's input into the string input. So we can see right here, input equals JOptionPane.show input dialog. And then we say, please enter your age. So that'll be the request that we display to the user. And then on the next line, we're going to go ahead and convert our input to an int and store that into age. And the way that we do that, the way that we perform that conversion, is by using the parseInt method of the integer class. So in addition to the primitive data type int, we also have a class that's kind of associated with it, which is that integer class that we see there. So let's go ahead and add this to our program. So right here, for this one, what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually use the same string for both of my input dialogs. That way then things will be a little bit simpler. So we're going to say string input is equal to our empty string. We'll go ahead and change it right here and right here. So I want to make sure that we're using the same variable throughout our program. In addition to that, we'll go ahead and do our int age, set this initially to 0. And so then what we'll go ahead and do is just have one input dialog, and then a message dialog, and then another input dialog, and then another message dialog. So for our next input, I'm going to say JOptionPane.show input dialog. And right here, we'll go ahead and say, please enter your age. And then underneath it, we'll go ahead and take the input that we get, and we'll go ahead and convert that to an int, so we can store that into age. So we're going to say age is equal to our integer.parseInt, and then we're going to put in our input. So we're taking the input that we got right here, so this input that we just got as a string, we're putting it into this parseInt method so that we can take that string and we can turn that into a numeric literal. So in this case, we specifically want it to be an int literal that we can put into our int variable age. And then right after this, we'll go ahead and actually display it. So in this case, do another message dialog. Oops. Show message dialog. Again, for our component, for the first one, it's just going to be null. For our second one, we'll go ahead and say your age is plus, we'll go ahead and do our string concatenation, so we'll say age plus a period. Go ahead and save that. And so then if we go ahead and run this, we'll just see an input dialog for entering our name. We'll see the message dialog where it gives us that initial greeting. When we click OK on the message dialog, it will then go to the next input dialog saying please enter your age. We'll go ahead and do that. That'll get stored into input. Input will then be parsed, so we'll take that string and convert it into an int to store that into age. And then we'll go ahead and add this last message dialog to say your age is, and whatever age we gave. So we'll go ahead and run this. So we'll say enter your name. So again, I'll just give it my name. Push OK. We'll get that first message dialog, say hello Brandon. Then go to please enter your age. So for this one, I'll just give it a made up arbitrary name number. So say 70. Go ahead and push OK. And then it'll go ahead and do that last message dialog and say your age is 70. Push OK on that one. So then coming back over here. So for each one of our 6 numeric data types, we have a particular method that we can use to convert our string to that data type. So we can see that we have one for byte, double, float, integer, long, and short. So in a moment, I'll give another example. In this one, we'll go ahead and use double. So we'll focus primarily on the 2 most commonly used numeric data types, which are going to be int and double. And then there's one last thing that I need to address. So whenever we're using dialog boxes in our programs, there is one extra line of code that we need to make sure we include at the very end, which is going to be the system.exit 0. So if you're familiar with this concept of exit codes, you might normally see an exit code of something like -1 that would indicate some kind of error had occurred. Exit code 0 is meant to indicate that you're exiting safely and securely, meaning that the program successfully ran to completion. So whenever we finish our program at the very end of our main method, we're going to use system.exit 0. So this is something very particular and very unique to using dialog boxes in your programs. So we can see the complete code right here for pretty much everything that I've done, with the one exception being that we need to go ahead and add that system.exit 0 at the very end. So go ahead and place that right here. Okay, I'll go ahead and save that. And so now if I were to run this, I'm not entirely sure if it was very noticeable, but we go through each one of these. And after I do this and I push OK, my program will immediately terminate. So if it wasn't particularly obvious, whenever you forget to include this, there will usually be a slight delay where essentially the program is trying to catch up with identifying the fact that it has actually completed. So in the background, it will kind of sort of figure that out. It just takes a moment longer. But depending on the nature of the program, there are certain circumstances where you could run into some more noticeable and more critical errors because you leave this off. But thankfully, none of the programs that we work on will be complex enough to give you that problem. All right, so now that we've seen this little example using input and message dialogs, I'm going to go ahead and kind of just remove most of the code that we have here so that I can replace this with what I actually intend for this to do, which is calculating a sales tax. So I'm going to go ahead and take away everything except for that first string for my input. So I'm still going to need that since I'm going to be using that to capture in a user input into message dialog boxes. In addition to this, I'm going to need to include 2 doubles. So the first one is going to be for that actual sales tax, so that's 6.25%. So I'll go ahead and do a double, and we'll call this sales tax. One of the things to note about this is that because we're dealing with a number or a value that is very unlikely to change anytime soon, it's not too unreasonable to consider treating this as a constant. So I'm actually going to say final double. And if I'm going to make this a constant, I want to go ahead and make sure that I follow the typical practice for its variable name. So I'm going to call it sales tax in all caps with that underscore separating it. And then I'm going to say this is equal to 0.0625. So this is going to be 6.25% as a decimal. And then in addition to that, I'm going to include another double. So this other one's going to be a variable since it's going to be dependent on what the user types, so it needs to change based on that. So we'll say double, and for this one we'll go ahead and say amount. You could also say something like total to basically represent the total of their purchase. So this double amount will be 0.0. Once we've got all that, we'll go ahead and include one message dialog to prompt the user about what this application is going to do. We'll then have the next one to actually request the input. So we'll have an input dialog, and then after that we'll do one final message dialog box to display the calculation of whatever their total is with that sales tax included. So we'll go ahead and do JOptionPane .show message dialog, and right here we're going to do null, and then we're going to say this program is used to calculate your total with sales tax, or with the sales tax of 6.25%. So one of the other things to note, if you have this open on NetBeans or maybe some similar IDE, usually you'll see this line right here, which is supposed to be a helpful reminder of about where your code should be cut off at. So you typically don't want it to be longer than that. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is move it to the next line. And thankfully, whenever I do this, it will automatically just fix it for me. So it's going to go ahead and make this into its own string literal, and then it's going to wrap the rest to the next line and then do the string concatenation. So one interesting thing to note about your strings, if you've tried to or have considered trying to make them on separate lines like this, keep in mind that you will need to use string concatenation to kind of separate it out as you move it through different lines of code like this. So once we've got this first, this initial message dialog box to prompt the user about what this program is meant to do, we'll then go ahead and do our input dialog. So we're going to get our input. This is going to be equal to our JOptionPane.show input dialog. Inside of here, we'll say, please enter the total amount of your purchase. And again, just like before, we can see that it kind of wraps to the next line like this. So again, go ahead and do it right here and move that to the next line. So just do the same thing I did before, relying on string concatenation to combine the two pieces of my string literal. So once we get our input, we'll go ahead and convert that to a double so that we can store that into amount. So I'm going to say amount is equal to our double class, so that's a capital D for this, dot parse double with our input. And so then once we've actually got our amount based on whatever the user's input was, we can go ahead and multiply that with our sales tax so we can display the result to the user. So we'll do another JOptionPane dot show message dialog. We'll call this null for the first argument, and then right here we'll say your total with tax is, and a $sign, and then we're going to go ahead and do some string concatenation to add on the total that we get. So I guess to be consistent with the other two, since we're putting the concatenation symbol on the next line right here, I'll just be consistent with it and just wrap that to here as well. And then after that, we'll go ahead and do our math operation. So to indicate this is a math operation, I'm going to wrap it in parentheses, and then we're just going to say whatever amount is times that sales tax. Okay. Go ahead and save that. And then we'll go ahead and run this and see how it looks. So we start off with that first message dialog saying this program is used to calculate your total with the sales tax of 6.25%. And push OK. We'll then say please enter the total amount of your purchase. So let's say, for its own sake, we'll just do something fairly simple like 100. We'll then go ahead and push OK. And then it's going to say your total with tax is, and then 625. And one thing I neglected to include was to add the amount back onto our calculation of just the sales tax amount. So we'll say amount plus amount times sales tax. So essentially what this is going to do is the amount times sales tax will give us however much we're spending on just the tax. So it's that $6.25 that we saw. Plus we also need to actually add in the amount again so we can get our our grand total. So we'll run this one more time, and this time we should be getting 106.25. And so now when we do this, your total with tax is $106.25. So go ahead and push OK, and then that will complete this program. So at this point, this is going to wrap up everything for message dialog boxes and input dialog boxes. This is also going to conclude all of the content for Chapter 2.